So this is going to be a guitar with a 500 millisecond delay, a quarter note delay at 120 BPMs. First is we're going to have no feedback. Then we're going to have feedback with attenuation at negative 18 dB and progressively remove the attenuation level until we hit 0 dB and the signal isn't being reduced at all. So first, no feedback. Okay. Attenuation at minus 18. So now we're starting to get somewhere, right? We hear that slow decay. Sounds very musical. So at minus 12, that delay was a little bit louder, and the repeating echoes took a longer time to trail off. And now attenuation at 0 dB, or essentially the signal is left alone. It's not being attenuated. So we could pretty much go on forever and ever with that. You could have a positive attenuation where it'll get louder and louder. I want to make a note that a lot of times what's being emulated has to do with what we're used to hearing on classic albums, and that all had to do with tape. And tape had a property where each time it's recorded over, each playback, the top end would be reduced. So the timbre would also change in each successive delay. We have the ability to recreate that on our computers. We also have the ability to remove that artifact that we're used to hearing should modern music production call for it. Parallel processing. So this is also going to tail into what we're going to discuss with auxiliary channels with a wet and dry output. Wet signal is very processed. Dry signal would be essentially what's coming into your DAW. So this wet and dry processing allows the user to mix these input and effect levels. So again, you'd have, if the dry was up at 100, wet was down to 0, you'd have just a dry signal, what was recorded. If wet was up at 100, dry was all the way down to 0, you'd have a very wet, very wet signal, something with a lot of delays or a lot of reverb, whatever that effect you're choosing. So these wet and dry signals allow us to adjust accordingly to taste. So filters, we talked about equalization a few weeks ago. Again, just like I mentioned in the previous slide, tapes have this natural frequency roll-off. We talked about a low cut and a high cut to attenuate the low end and emulate tapes. Here's an example of a high pass or low cut, same thing. A low pass or high cut, where a low cut or high pass, we're removing the low end, letting the highs pass through. Low pass or high cut, again the same thing, is cutting out the highs, allowing the low end to pass through. This particular delay has a link, so you could link the high pass and low pass together so they move congruently. And again, in analog tape delays, the repeating delays naturally become darker, or they lose high end. So this is used for propagational purposes as well. We discussed with reverbs in larger spaces, if you have echoes coming back at you, the physical properties of sound in a natural acoustic space, sound will be reflected at you a little bit darker. This is also used for smoothing out delays. By taking out that high end, you could really tuck in a delay, have it in the background, still be there but not very present. And again, used for propagational effects, adding dimension, thickness, or you can leave it alone for effect purposes. Say if you want a repeating phrase, if you wanted it to sound like there are multiple guitars being tracked and there's only one, you could have some psychoacoustic effects creating a pseudo stereo image of a mono track by avoiding these high and low pass filters. So now we're going to leave the world of tape delays for a little bit and go into digital delay adaptation. Since we're all working in a computer at this point, these tape delays were emulated for their sounds, for their characteristics, for their ease of use, usability. Now, in the 21st century, we have adaptations specific for computers that allow us to manipulate delays in ways that couldn't be done prior. First, sample delay. So a sample delay will delay your input signal, and this will be used for phase correction. We talked about positive and negative amplitudes canceling each other out. This is going way back to maybe the first or second lecture. When you have a positive amplitude against a negative amplitude, you start creating nulls. It's going to change the timbre of the instrument. So we could use this by just nudging the waveform over a little bit. It can be calculated through tempo or milliseconds if you have the measurements. Again, we talked about the speed of sound in our first propagation lecture. 1,130 feet per second equates to roughly 1 millisecond per foot. And then you could also use a sample delay for that thickening Haas effect. So I have this pre-recorded synth bass. There was a direct input on that synthesizer, as well as a microphone on the bass cabinet. And tonally, it changes 100%, in my opinion. I want you to listen to the bass with no phase correction. It's going to sound very nasally, like there's a lot of mid-range 1K in that. And now with phase correction, all of a sudden, this low end opens up, and you don't have that mid-range in there to take up the space away from vocals, guitars, etc. So here's a synth bass with no phase correction. And here's a synth bass with phase correction. And that's achieved by simply delaying the microphone signal just a little bit from that direct sample. Here's a vocal sample dry. We're going to be looking at the Haas effect.
You move like a ghost. You move like a ghost across the room.
And now a vocal sample with Haas effect.
You move like a ghost. You move like a ghost across the room.
You can hear it adds a lot of thickening. There's a live recording, so there's a lot of bleed in there, but it thickens up the vocal very nicely. Stereo delays. Stereo delays we use to enhance the stereo image. When I talk about stereo image, again, going back to this picture, the stereo image left and right, as opposed to the depth. So again, stereo delays enhance the stereo image. Computer processing allows us to easily configure delay times to a tempo, which was a little bit more difficult to do in the days of tape delay, but based on two different delay units set to two different delay times or rhythms, and we can have this ping-pong delay, a ping-pong effect, which is created by panning the feedback. So again, the feedback loop, that recorded delay sample, that delayed playback fed back into the record head. So we could take that feedback from one of the delays, send it to the opposite side, and that gets fed back and cross-fed to the left and right. So this is kind of creates a bouncing effect, which is why it's called a ping-pong delay. And the amount is controlled by what's called the cross-feed parameter. So we have that here. Again, we have two delay units all in one. And we could send the feedback of this left delay to the feedback of the right delay. The delay times are separate. Again, synced to 1/8 note, 250 milliseconds, so it's about 120 BPM. Quarter note, 500 milliseconds in the left at 120 BPM. So we have the input of the delay signal going through the delay circuit, sent to the output, as well as getting picked off and being sent to the input of the right signal. That going through the delay keeps being cross-fed back and forth. So stereo delay versus a ping-pong delay. So the stereo delay, we're going to remove that cross-feed element. So it's just going to be two separate delay times in each ear.
Ah, you move like a ghost. You move like a ghost across the room.
Now we're going to use that ping pong vocal sample with the crossfeed.
Ah, you move like a ghost. You move like a ghost across the room.
And you could hear how it's starting to almost sound more and more like a reverb, actually. And again, it goes to the idea that reverbs are thousands and thousands of delays happening, very short delays happening simultaneously. Next, we're going to have a multi-tap delay. This is very cool for effects. You hear it all the time in pop music with the repeating phrases. This is designed to have exact, precise control over every single delay, every single feedback. We have the same controls as other delays with added features. You could see in this version of a multi-tap delay, we have the original signal. We could adjust every single delay up to 6 delays, where they're being panned to, how long each delay is. We could EQ each delay. So it gives you exact, precise control over every single delay. We could have very, very short delays for Haas effect. We can extend the delays for kind of a repeating echo. You could adjust the volume of each delay. This is used a lot in synthesis too, in sound design, creating different timbres, different effects. Here's just 3 very different approaches to this tap delay, all using the same source sample. So we'll listen to the original source sample first. And here's a multi-tap pattern 1. So you have different panning, different rhythms that was created within that delay. Here's multi-tap 2. And 3. So in that example, each successive delay, it was EQ'd separately for these timbral nuances, kind of creating a swelling effect. So all in all, delay times in practice, we use samples to correct phase, or pan left and right for the Haas effect, enhances stereo imaging, creating a thicker texture. 30 milliseconds and below roughly create that Haas effect. 20 to 60 milliseconds is kind of this faux doubling. 60 to 100, even I say 130 milliseconds, create this echo or kind of a slap back effect. And longer delays are usually more dependent on tempo. You're gonna either want to tap in a tempo, find a millisecond that works, or you're not creating disjunct rhythms in the delay times that would distract from the composition. And that's it for this lecture. Again, I appreciate everybody's time. I'm going to go back into Pro Tools and discuss auxiliary channels.